Hello, good afternoon, welcome. I'm delighted you're here at Kew Gardens. This is in fact the first rain we've had for about 6 weeks, so although you're not seeing the gardens perhaps at their most sunny, the rain, as you might imagine, is desperately needed. The gardens are looking decidedly parched for what is just the first week of June. But we're really thrilled that the Society for Environment could be here and wanted to be here. I'm going to talk very briefly about one aspect of our work that I hope is of relevance to you, and then my colleague Michael Way is going to talk about another aspect which is more directly linked to conservation, seed banking, which is where he works. So we've been doing a lot of work at Kew, trying to answer the sort of question that I think an intelligent 12-year-old might ask, which is, what is the purpose of a botanic garden, an institution like Kew in the 21st century? We have these wonderful landscapes, we have scientists, we have collections. Just down there in the basement, we have the world's largest collection of mycology, for instance, the largest fungal collection in the world. But so what? What is our purpose in the 21st century? And in trying to answer that question, we wanted to ensure it was grounded in the big global challenges that will affect every country, every individual, every society in the 21st century, the big challenges of the 21st century. And you'll be entirely familiar with this one, of course, most recently highlighted with the IPBES report 3 weeks ago, with their startling statistic that probably 1 in 8 of all species, 1 million out of an estimated 8 million species across the animal, plant, and fungal kingdom are at threat of extinction. So we live in an age of extinction, and the rate of extinction is, of course, accelerating. So this is a global challenge to which Kew's endeavours are relevant, as is this. How do we feed a growing population at a time of climate change, and at a time when we're already extraordinarily reliant upon a narrow thread of genetic diversity? There's an estimated 30,000 plants in the world that are in some way edible, and yet 50% of all human calories come from just 3 plants, maize, rice, and wheat. About 2/3 of all human calories come from about 10 plants. And of course, those plants have been selectively bred maybe 10, maybe 15,000 years for yield, but not for resilience. And they too are struggling with climate change. So we have biodiversity loss, we have food security, and we have urbanization, particularly prevalent in Africa and parts of Asia. The estimate is that about 70% of the global population will live in urban environments by 2050, which is not that far away. And this brings direct health and mental health and physical health challenges, but it also, of course, brings the risk of nature blindness, that people are disconnected from nature. One of the projects Kew is working on at the moment is we are providing horticultural expertise to Guleli Botanic Garden in Ethiopia, Addis Ababa. Addis Ababa is like a case study of a rapidly growing, poorly planned African city. It's huge. No one really knows how many people are there, but certainly about 10 million or higher. It has one patch of green space, which is the Botanic Garden. It's the one place where those 10 million citizens can directly engage with nature without taking quite a long journey. So urbanization is a relevant challenge as well. So then the question is, well, okay, what can Kew actually do about that? What are we actually going to try and do? And we've come up with these 4 generic headings. And in a sense, Kew has always done versions of these. I mean, much of Kew's work in the 19th and early 20th century was the creation of floras, encyclopedias, if you like, of plant diversity. So the first on this list, in a sense, is what we've always done, to document and to research global plant and fungal diversity and its benefits for global health and for humanity. But how we're doing that in the future is actually rather different. So, for instance, we're doing a lot of work now on digitization, on genomic analysis, which of course was not the focus of the 19th and 20th centuries. But that's fundamentally Kew's business, is to understand plant and fungal diversity and make that knowledge accessible and useful to scientists, conservationists, researchers all around the world. Secondly, is to directly conserve plant and fungal diversity. If you've been into the Temperate house here, for instance, we have about 1,500 different species in that building, some of which are critically endangered in the wild, some of which are extinct in the wild. So in that sense, a botanic garden is an analog of a zoological collection of critically endangered or extinct in the wild animals. But beyond that, of course, there is also the work of the Millennium Seed Bank, which Dr. Way will talk about. The third one, educate the next generation. And in particular, we want to focus on postgraduate education of scientists, and we want this to be global. Ideally, we would have several hundred students each year at Kew from Colombia, from Madagascar, from Indonesia, from Brazil, the most biodiverse countries in the world, coming to Kew to learn about taxonomy, about conservation, about seed science, about natural capital. And that is our vision. We have about 100 postgraduate students already at Kew, PhD and MSc students, but we would love to significantly grow that number and make it very international. And that is one of the areas where we're fundraising, is for scholarships, for example, for Colombian students to come to Kew, and then, of course, to return to Colombia, the second most biodiverse country in the world. And finally, and these aren't necessarily in order of importance. I mean, you could make a strong case for each of those. But the fourth is to build public understanding of biodiversity. And I think this is incredibly important, because I have the simple belief that if the public are concerned about something, then the politicians and the policymakers are more likely to respond. A good recent case study, of course, was the famous plastics episode in Blue Planet, but there are many others. So I think this is incredibly important. We had for many years at Kew David Attenborough as a trustee. He's a local resident. And he has always argued, of course, that if the public understands something, they're more likely to care. And if they care, they're more likely to conserve. And I think I agree with that. I think that's a very clear, logical chain. And part of our job here is to help people to understand. And so again, if you were to visit the Temperate House, you would see all of the interpretation. So that's the signage that we offer our visitors. Although it's a heritage setting, a Victorian building, all of the narrative is around contemporary stories in plant science and conservation, often the work of our own scientists. So for instance, work being done in Ethiopia on a wild banana relative that is climate resilient, looking at the genomics and the distribution of that plant. Now, these four generic themes, but actually in this presentation, because there is little time, I was just going to give you some examples of the fourth of these, building public understanding of diversity. And that's, of course, the principal purpose of these gardens. And to me, Kew should be unashamedly a scientific experience. It should be an educational experience. If people come to Kew and wander around and all they do is have a pot of tea and admire the roses, we have failed as an institution. People should learn about the importance of the natural world in Kew. And our challenge is to do that in a way that is vivid and memorable and most importantly, stimulates curiosity to learn more. So I mentioned the Temperate House a couple of times because this was subject to a 5-year, very extensive restoration. It reopened about a year ago. It's been flooded with visitors. We had 50,000 visitors in the first weekend it opened. It's got about 11,000 plants in it, about 1,500 species. And I put this slide first because clearly our living collections are the most important interpretation. The beauty and the diversity of the plant forms is the most powerful calling card we have to hook people on the importance of nature and conserving nature. But as I mentioned, this is in fact the example I mentioned, telling powerful stories is also part of that. And this in fact is a completely new approach to interpretation by Kew to tell contemporary stories of plant science and conservation. And you'll see here the picture of the scientist James Deverell, the actual work that individuals are doing in the field to try and make it relevant and immediately applicable. This is about people not going hungry in Ethiopia and not causing crises of refugees, et cetera, with the future challenge of food security. A completely different example is this. I don't know if any of you have had a chance to visit it. It's about 200 meters from here. We wanted to do something at Kew that tried to bring alive the relationship between plants and animals. Plants can't move, so they need vectors for pollination. Most plants are pollinated by insects. There's an astonishing fact in the IPBES report that 3/4 of all food crops are pollinated by animals, overwhelmingly insects. So if we don't look after the insects, we're not going to have any food. So we had this notion of doing something about plant-insect interactions. And then we learned about this, which was the British Pavilion at the World Expo in Milan in 2015. And the overarching theme of that expo was how to feed a hungry planet. And the British designer came up with this idea of a beehive to bring alive the work that bees do in pollinating crop plants and therefore feeding a hungry planet. But instead of doing some posters and signs and so on, he created a 20-meter high recreation of a beehive. And it's quite hard to describe, but the lights you see here, and there are sounds as well, constantly modulate depending on the activities of real bees in a real beehive at Kew through something that registers the movement, the amount of vibration in the beehive. So when you step inside this, it's meant to be akin to stepping into a beehive, and you are surrounded by the lights and the sound, which are in turn being driven by the activities of real bees. And of course, there are signs explaining the role that bees play in global food security. But it's using art to convey an important conservation message. And it has been hugely popular. This opened in summer 2016, and that year we saw a 17% increase in our visitors, which for an organization that's been around for many centuries is quite a jump. Completely different example again, and this comes directly from our science in this building. For 3 years now, we've published a report called State of the World's Plants. In fact, the last one, there was State of the World's Fungi, so 2 plants, 1 fungi. And they answer direct questions. What have we discovered? What do we know about extinction? What about illegal trade? What impact is climate change having? A standard set of, again, questions of childlike simplicity, but I think if you answer them evidentially and with clarity, incredibly powerful. So we've done these reports. One of the important things about these is that they get a lot of media coverage. So the State of the World's Fungi miraculously ended up on the front page of the Financial Times, a newspaper not known for its interest in mycology. So you can reach a wide audience, but also, of course, they're used by the science and conservation community as well, and there's a 2-day symposium here. But more recently, just in the last couple of months, we've translated these science publications into a visitor-facing exhibition at the Millennium Seed Bank at Wakehurst, using all the, so this is the poster for it on the right here, and in particular focusing on 5 trees and the challenges they face, trees from around the world. So one is the monkey puzzle tree from Chile, for example. But we've translated the science research into a visitor-facing interpretation, again, all around the themes of environmental change, climate change in particular. We host annual science festivals. The concept is very simple, which is our scientists talk directly to children, families and children. We host them both at Kew and at Wakehurst. We have about 30 different stalls covering all sorts of things, from how do you measure the height of a tree in the field, to how do you extract DNA, how do you prepare a herbarium specimen, how do plants distribute their seeds, etc., etc. It's meant to be fun, it's meant to be educating, but most importantly, it's meant to reveal to children that science can be revelatory and fun, and it's done by real people who look a bit like them. It tries to demystify science. It's a great thing for us to do. The one at Kew is in July, if people would like to come. We host an annual Orchid Festival, and for about the last 5 or 6 years, we've been putting a country theme around these. And that works really well, because it allows us, obviously, to tell stories about that country's biodiversity and, if relevant, our work in that country. So last year was Colombia, which is the right-hand image, and the year before that was Thailand. You can guess that's the left-hand image. And Colombia in particular, it's the 2nd most biodiverse country in the world. There's 4,370 species of orchid have already been scientifically described in Colombia. And of course, much of Colombia has been inaccessible for the last 40 or 50 years because of the conflict. So for botanists, this is the most exciting country in the world. And Kew has a number of projects in the field working with our Colombian partners. So this exhibition, yes, it's a lovely sort of burst of tropical color and botanical, glory in February, March in our Princess of Wales glasshouse. But crucially, it gave us an opportunity to talk about the importance of Colombian biodiversity and the work that Kew and Colombian organizations, of course, are doing to conserve it. People were queuing for 45 minutes to get into the glasshouse, which on the one hand, it worried me because you don't see long queues like that. But on the other hand, it is really heartening that people are willing to stand and wait for 45 minutes to see Colombian orchids and to hear about Colombian biodiversity. This is another example again. One of the challenges that any organization like Kew or the Tate, the British Museum faces is you have your footprint. In Kew's case, obviously, southwest London and Sussex with Wakehurst. So how do you reach people beyond that? And so all of these institutions have to varying degrees outreach, i.e. reaching people beyond their institutional location. Kew has been working for about 5 years on a project called Grow Wild, which has been fully funded by the rather wonderful Big Lottery Fund. And in essence, what it does is it engages people to grow wild plants directly, wild plants and fungi more recently. We did plants for the first 4 years. In the last year or so, we've been doing fungi. And there are multiple tiers to it. The bottom tier is several 100,000 seed kits and mycological kits have been sent out. So individuals could grow a couple of square meters of wild plants, for instance, with different seed kits for Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, etc. But at the top of the pyramid, there's a sort of championship project in each of the 4 nations. So I visited the one in Northern Ireland, for instance, which was the conversion of a piece of waste ground into a wildflower meadow. And what made it so powerful, so they got a grant, I think, of maybe 10 or 15,000 pounds, and it was a proper community project. But what made it so powerful was, being Northern Ireland, there were rather divided communities, and this reason it was abandoned and wild land was it was between the 2 communities. It was almost no man's land. But the creation of a wildflower meadow had done very powerful things to bring these 2 previously alienated communities together, plus, of course, had created this great burst of biodiversity on what was previously waste ground. And then just some thoughts about going forward. I personally think one of the biggest challenges for humanity in the 21st century is food security, the ability to feed a rapidly growing population at a time of climate change. Summer 2022, we're intending to make food security the theme of our big visitor-facing program. We want to help people to understand the issues around food security, the role of wild relatives, the role around climate-resilient crops and climate-resilient research. But I put this slide up to be a bit more provocative because I also think that we would be mad, I don't mean Kew, I mean Britain, America, the world would be mad to discard GM as a potential tool to finding solutions in food security. And there are a couple of examples here. The left-hand example is the golden rice that has vitamin A bred into it. The right-hand example is a variety of rice that is flood tolerant. Rice needs a lot of water, but it doesn't like to be submerged. It will die within about 10 to 12 days. You see here on the test the normal variety on the left, the flood-tolerant GM rice on the right. And the reason I mention GM isn't because I'm an advocate for or against, really, but I think it's a good example where public misunderstanding leads to poor policy decisions. And you ask people about GM and they don't like it. And they don't like it because it's not natural, which implies to me they have no understanding at all of how unnatural orthodox agriculture is, or indeed how damaging orthodox agriculture is. And then they have a diabetic friend who's quite happy to inject GM insulin into their arm, but eating GM crops is wrong. So I think there are layers of public misunderstanding here. But if we're serious about cracking the problem of food security, we should not, I think, as a society, turn our mind away from GM as a potential tool in the toolkit. And another one that I think is fascinating. Has anyone seen of this or heard of this? This one is called Impossible Burger. There are a variety out there. Another one's called Beyond Meat. This one actually is also a GM product in that they modified soya to enhance the volume of heme, the molecule heme that is extracted from soy. It's basically the same heme as in hemoglobin. It gives it that meaty flavor. The point about this is that this company, Impossible Burger, was set up by a professor of medical biochemistry at Stanford University. He had his sabbatical year about 6 or 7 years ago in California. And instead of just going surfing, he sat in his garden and thought, given my knowledge of biochemistry, what contribution can I make to the biggest global challenge of our time? And he believed the biggest global challenge of our time was the loss of wild environments, particularly forestry, for grazing, for beef, because people like eating beef and beef burgers. So he set himself the challenge of producing a beef burger that was utterly indistinguishable from a beef-derived beef burger, but was entirely derived from plant materials. So he wasn't aiming at the vegan or vegetarian market, he was aiming at the carnivorous market. Indistinguishable taste, texture, appearance, but cheaper and healthier. After 5 years, they produced their first burger, and of course it cost $1 million or whatever. They're in version 3. They're now on sale throughout America. I've tried one, and had I not known what I was eating, I would have guaranteed I was eating meat. I would have guaranteed to you I was eating meat. Not quite sure I've said beef, but it was definitely meat, except it isn't. It's all plant-derived. Anyway, I mention this because I think this is a really fascinating example of how technology can start to provide solutions. And the environmental footprint of this product is about 1/30th in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and water of the comparable cow beef-derived beef burger. So interesting stories we can tell. And then finally, of course, biofuels. Another interesting and contentious area, so it's not finally penultimate. You know, there are advocates for biofuels, there are advocates against. I think, again, the role for CURE, if we're serious about engaging people with the challenges of the 21st century, is to really understand. Biofuels, of course, is a broad church. There are many different technologies, many different things happening here. But to help the public understand the issues around this, and which are beneficial and which perhaps are not, I think is incredibly important. And finally, I just think there are some really remarkable examples of urban horticulture, urban forestry. This looks like one of those CGI architect's mock-ups. It's not. It's a photograph of a real building in Milan. It's called the Bosque Forest, Milan. And it's remarkable. I've seen it. You do a double take. There are some even more extreme examples of horticulture woven into architecture in China. Really remarkable. I was told recently in this room, actually, that London itself would actually be categorized as a forest, given the density of trees, not just the big parks, but also the urban horticulture in the streets and the garden landscapes. So I think given the rate of urbanization, given the role for urban horticulture, it can cool temperatures, it can take particulate pollution out, it provides aesthetic benefits, it provides pollinator services. Again, there's a great role, I think, for an organization like CUE to advocate urban horticulture, urban forestry in particular, and the biodiversity benefits it can bring. So I give you those at the end as slightly more contemporary and contentious examples. So that's it really. I mean, I haven't tried to cover everything. I've just tried to give you some examples of the ways in which I hope we can build public understanding of what biodiversity is and why it matters, and why I hope that everyone in Britain will recognise the importance of supporting our native and global biodiversity. Thank you.